gave up on the Wi-Fi here, so we'll see if this works out any better. Okay, well, as Dan said, we're in the book of Daniel, and last time we saw how the Babylonians had started this reprogramming effort for Daniel and his three friends, and also there were other Jews there, Jews that were selected from among those who had been carried off to Babylon from Judah around 605 BC. And so this was really a program of indoctrinating these kids, most of them were kids, into the worldview of Babylon. And so the reprogramming included studying the language and the literature of the Babylonians. They had a special diet, and they trained them in royal protocol. And so the goal was to reorient these people into the thoughts, beliefs, and practices of the Babylonians. And so it included some educational content, food, and then time. There was a time period. They were going to be trained for 3 years. And then the Babylonian commander even changed the names of 4 of these boys. They probably were mid-teens, so high school age. Before, all their names had references to the God of Israel. There was Daniel, and that means God is my judge. Hananiah means Yahweh has been gracious. Mishael means who or what is God. And Azariah means Yahweh has helped. And so we see in all those names El or Yah. And El is short for Elohim, and Yah is short for Yahweh. So those are 2 of God's names in the Old Testament. Well, the commander, the Babylonian commander, wanted to change their identities, and so he changed their names. And he changed Daniel to Belteshazzar, which means Bel protects his life. Hananiah he changed to Shadrach, and that means command of Aku, or I am fearful of Aku. Mishael was changed to Meshach. Meshach means who is what Aku is. And Azariah was changed to Abednego, which means servant of the Shining One, or servant of Nebo. And those new names are all references to the gods of the Babylonians, Bel, Aku, and Nebo. And so we observe that our world also wants to change our identity so that we identify with worldly values instead of God's values. And we saw there are secular studies that are actually published in peer-reviewed secular journals, which conclude that it is government control of the education system that has the biggest impact on the decreasing religiosity in America and other nations, and the resulting increase in secularization. They also found there's a big increase in secularization, becoming worldly during the high school years. And that corresponds to the age of these 4 young men who were in Babylon. 3 years in Babylon and 4 years for our high school. Well, that puts parents of school-age children in a tough spot because homeschooling is quite a big commitment, and private school is very expensive. But now that we know about this problem, we should try to do as much as we can. And at least we should try to offset the secular influence. There also has been a marked decrease in church attendance over the years. In the early 1900s, the average number of Sundays that people attended church was 31 times. And by 1990, this was down to 22 times. And they think today it's down to something like 12 on average. So the average person goes to church 12 times a year. There's also a big decrease in the percentage of Americans that go to church on any Sunday. It's almost half of what it was when I was a kid. So one thing parents can do is take their kids to church. If church is not important to the parents, then why would it be important to the kids? And if church isn't important, then why would the kids think that God is important? That's what the kids will think. God and Jesus must not be important. So we can see from observation and scholarly studies that the world's reprogramming effort is having some success. It's decreasing religiosity and increasing secularism among the young people as new generations come along. And it's also decreased church attendance quite substantially. So we'll see in tonight's passage, and we're looking at Daniel 1, 8 to 21, we'll see how Daniel and his friends respond to this reprogramming effort of the Babylonians, how they remained true to God, and they did it by resolving not to defile themselves, respecting the secular authorities by their words and their actions, and receiving God's blessing because of their resolve and the respect that they were showing to the authorities. And so this should give us some wisdom and understanding for how we can respond in our current situation. And so that's Daniel 1, 8 to 21. And I moved my little Leo here, so I should get right there. All right, here we go. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Well, so we start out today's passage with Daniel resolving not to defile himself with the food and the wine. And we might normally think in passive terms about not being defiled by the world. The text says Daniel determined not to defile himself. And so Daniel understood that he would be defiled only if he did it to himself. The world can take you away from home to a foreign land and change your name and spend years putting you through a retraining program, but you can still resolve not to defile yourself. And likewise, it's on us not to be defiled by the world. We have to be proactive about it. And there's an interesting little wordplay going on here in the Hebrew. It says in verse 7 that the commander gave them new names. And literally it says that the commander set on them new names. And the Hebrew verb is yaser. which means to give, place, or set. And it's used twice in verse 7. It says that he set to them names. He set to Daniel, Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. And then in verse 8, it says that Daniel set upon his heart that he would not defile himself. And he uses the same Hebrew word, yaser. And it struck me as kind of a different use of yaser, especially when it comes to naming. Usually in the Old Testament, we would find that somebody called his name Daniel or gave him the name Daniel using a different Hebrew word for called or gave. And so yaser has the sense to me of imposing these names on the boys. And so it seems to me that the writer is trying to do something with what he is saying. So where the commander was setting names on Daniel and his friends in an attempt to reprogram them and their identities, Daniel sets in his heart not to defile himself. So he's not going to give in to the reprogramming effort, but he's going to stay true to God. And so it has the same sense to me that Daniel is imposing upon himself the choice not to be defiled. And that's what we have to do. The world will try to impose new names, so to speak, on us. It will try to alter our identities and keep us from finding our identity in Christ. But we have to set in our hearts not to defile ourselves, not to give in to the world's attempts at reprogramming us. And that's going to take a purposeful decision on our part. And you remember, Daniel said in his heart not to defile himself. So it's not a matter of standing by passively as we are defiled, but it's a matter of giving in to the world and thereby defiling ourselves. We do it to ourselves. And so it's up to us to make the choices. Well, at least I am not worried about Jewish food purity rules. I don't know about you. So what is it that would defile us? And Jesus helps us out in Mark 7:18 to 23, where he says, "Are you so dull?" he asked. "Don't you see that nothing enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body." In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. He went on, "What comes out of a person is what defiles them, for it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person." And those of you who have subscribed to my blog got this during the week. And for viewers out there, you can go there, telosmins.org, and you can subscribe. Or you can send me your email and I'll put it in for you. I try to get one or two posts out during the week, but I don't always make it. And Pastor Dan said that the commenting part seems to be broken, so I need to look into that. And Paul in Romans, which we just looked at, he has a few more things for us to think about. And so he says in Romans 1:28 to 32, "Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. And so both Paul and Jesus will tell us that it is not simply that these things defile us, but that these things reveal the nature of our hearts and our minds. And we are defiled when we practice those things. And I do find Paul's list kind of amusing because in Christian circles we will judge idol worshipers and homosexuals rather harshly, but we kind of skip over some of these other things. And Paul says that people who gossip deserve death. And that's kind of interesting. Well, Jesus and Paul will also tell us that we are not going to be able to overcome the defiled states of our hearts and our minds by our own efforts and with our own resources. And even if we were to have some external success, it will only accrue to our own glory. We will boast about it. And so it's better to realize, hey, I've got a problem with gossip or deceit or whatever. Confess the sin to God and ask or even beg him for his righteousness. And Daniel also, he lived under the old covenant, but we have been grafted into the new covenant. And the new covenant says, I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will forgive their wickedness, and will remember their sins no more. And that's a quote from Hebrews 8, if you want to look it up. So it's New Testament, but in Hebrews it's a quotation from Jeremiah 31 to 34. And that hasn't been completely fulfilled yet. We are still teaching our neighbors to know the Lord because not everyone knows the Lord yet. And also it says in Jeremiah that God will be making this new covenant with Israel and Judah. And so we Gentile Christians have been grafted in, and we live partially under the new covenant. Someday it will be completely fulfilled when Israel and Judah come back to God and they realize that Jesus is Messiah. But Hebrews tells us that we are living under the new covenant. And so if we are God's people, he will write his laws on our hearts. In other words, he will change our hearts so that the kind of things that Jesus and Paul mentioned no longer flow out from them. And that will take time, and we still have to set upon our hearts not to be defiled, to let the Holy Spirit purify our hearts and minds, and to discontinue doing those things that are not pleasing to God, and to start doing things that are pleasing to God. And we saw also that Paul says in Romans 12 that we should no longer be conformed to the pattern of this world, but we should be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Then we will be able to tell what the will of God is. But we have to offer our bodies to God as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. And that is what Daniel and his friends did. But he was operating under a different economy. He was operating under the old covenant. So the first thing we have to do is set our hearts not to defile ourselves. While we are doing this, we must still respect other people. One of God's main laws is to love your neighbor as yourself. So in verses 8 to 14, we see how Daniel went about not defiling himself. I'll read it again. The last part of 8. Daniel, asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned you your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to do this and tested them for 10 days. So we notice that Daniel went to the official and asked permission not to eat the food and defile himself. We are all Americans. No offense to the Palauans out there. We're Americans or Palauans. And the first thing we would do is probably go out and file a lawsuit. And maybe that's not the first thing we would do. Nobody is going to make us eat meat, I don't think. And we are fortunate to have a First Amendment and various other laws that protect us actually pretty well from being required to do things that violate our conscience. That also works to the advantage of different religions and even to people who have no religion. And so there can be some tension in things. We would like to have prayer in school, but that may violate the conscience of someone who has a different faith or someone who has no faith at all. And so the result is that generally we have no government-sponsored or directed prayers in school or in other government places. Now, on the one hand, I don't like that because I think prayer is important, provided the prayer is to our God. But on the other hand, I would not want to see prayers to Allah or prayers to Satan being sponsored by the government if people of those faiths ever became the majority and got into power. And so now it's okay because we're in the majority, but that may not always be the case. And I do think that we could go to government officials, we could go to the high school, for example, or maybe other businesses in town, and we could ask permission as Christians to do certain things. And I think that the schools and other places would generally allow that to happen if it was reasonable. One thing that we have that other faiths do not have is we have the one true God. And so we see in verse 9 that God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. And God might do that for us as well. We'll see later in Daniel that there are times when God does not cause people to show favor or sympathy. But in this case, he did. Well, this official had concerns. He was afraid of the king and what would happen to him if he did not do what the king had told him to do. And then what if Daniel and the others showed up not looking as good as all of the other young men when it came time to stand before the king? Then the king would have his head, and that's a pretty legitimate concern. In those days, the king would just lop your head off if he was unhappy with you. So when we are wanting to avoid defiling ourselves or wanting to do something for God, the people in authority might also have concerns. Probably not about losing their heads, but something sort of similar. Maybe they'll lose their job, or a business might lose customers, or they might just have problems created by having these crazy Christians doing things. So what does Daniel do? Daniel sets up a plan. He says to this guard, test us for 10 days and see what happens. And lo and behold, after the 10-day trial period, the 4 of them looked better than any of the others. And the commentators say that this is God's miraculous provision, because there is no basis at all for thinking that a vegetable diet would have this kind of effect on people. They wouldn't look that much better just because they ate only vegetables. And so there's a lesson for us when we are faced with a dilemma involving our faith and other people, whether they're government officials or maybe our employer or businesses or just our neighbors, maybe our families. Instead of getting in their face, we can show them respect and come up with a plan and say, hey, let's try this thing out and see what happens. And so what came to my mind as I thought about this was the orders banning in-person church services. And a few years ago, we went to Rolling Hills Church down in Tualatin. Rolling Hills is quite a large church, and it has quite a large facility. And for some reason, I'm still on their email list. And so periodically, I get updates from Pastor Bill. And so if you give me your email, just be aware that it may be permanent. Well, we found it kind of humorous and really kind of appalling that Rolling Hills could not have church at all. And then when all churches got some leeway from the state, Rolling Hills could have 25 people in their building, just like us. That's kind of amusing, and actually it's appalling. Rolling Hills could easily fit 1,000 people in their building and do it quite safely. And this shows the sort of I'm going to say bad side of the orders, because not too far away from Rolling Hills is Fred Meyer. And Fred Meyer was allowed to have all kinds of people come into the store and buy things. And apparently it was done quite safely. So, well, I don't know if they did it. I think maybe they might have. I don't know if it was successful, but Rolling Hills could have gone to the government officials and said, look, let us have a few people in our building, and we'll see how it goes. We'll do it very safely, but we could have easily 500 people in our building, and it's not going to cause any problems. And I think if they did, and if they didn't, it would not have been successful. And so it's very unfair in light of who was allowed to open. And so some churches ended up filing lawsuits, and they were probably right to do so. That's how our system works. If one government official says no, well, you go up the ladder until you can convince somebody to do the right thing. So we would have to abide by whatever decision came down from the courts, but the time may come when we would have to go ahead and have in-person church, regardless of what the government says, and then face the consequences. So in verses 15 and 16, we see God's blessing at work. After this test run, the 4 looked better than all the others, and so they were not compelled to eat and drink the unclean food and wine. And it appears from the story that Daniel and his 3 friends were the only people from among all the Jews that did not eat the meat and the food and thereby defile themselves. And so it's very possible that we too will be in the minority if we choose to follow God's will in our lives, and it's maybe even likely. Most people will just go ahead and let their kids go to public schools and be programmed by the public school system. We will let ourselves be programmed by the TV and the movies and the music and the social media that we watch. I include myself in there because we sent our kids to public school, and I have not always been careful about the media that I engage with. For example, I get tired of the TV sometimes, and so I'll turn on YouTube, and then YouTube will put up song after song after song, all of the same type or from the same artist, and it's kind of cool. Well, one song came on, and it's really quite good from a musical standpoint. I really liked it, but the lyrics are talking about kids surfing all day, and then when the sun goes down, they make a fire on the beach, and somebody starts playing guitar, and then they have sex on the beach. And so it's a great song, but the message is not, it's not a good message from God's point of view. Then I saw, I think just today, that my brother-in-law posted something on Facebook. Some kids asked their dad if they could watch a movie, and so the dad checked it out, and he said no, because it had nudity and premarital sex and some foul language. And the kids said, "What? It's not that bad, Dad. It's PG-13, and those bad parts are only a small part of the whole movie." Well, Dad stuck to his guns, and then he went in the kitchen and made some brownies. And the brownies smelled so good that the kids thought, oh, well, maybe Dad feels bad and he's going to change his mind. When the brownies were done, they went in the kitchen to have some, and the dad said, well, before you eat them, I want to tell you something about the brownies. I made them from scratch, and I used all organic ingredients, including just a teaspoon of an organic ingredient I found in the backyard. It is only a little part of the whole batch. It doesn't change the taste or the texture of the brownie at all. Well, the kids ask, well, what is the ingredient? And the dad says, well, it's dog poop. Needless to say, the kids did not eat the brownies, and the dad said, what? It's only a small part of the brownies. It's only a small part of the entire batch, and it doesn't change the taste or the texture at all. Well, hopefully the kids got the message, and I think probably we all have got the message too. That's a pretty good story. So all of the other Jews must have said, well, it's not really a big deal if I eat this meat. I'm in captivity after all, and I need to comply with what these Babylonians are saying. But not Daniel and his friends. Like I said last time, we did our best to offset the influence of the public schools on our kids. And actually, Canby public schools have always been pretty good. And they have a large number of Christians, teachers, administrators, and other staff. And plus, there's something to be said for staying involved, being salt and light in the world, as Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. Giving a godly seasoning in the world and being his light in the world. We also made sure our kids were in church almost every week. One time someone came and said, let's play in this soccer league. Well, the games were almost all on Sunday, and so if we had joined the league, we would have missed church for months. And the group of kids had grown up together, and mostly they were all from church-going families. And so the parents, probably the moms mostly, they were unanimous that we were not going to join this league and play soccer when the games were mostly on Sundays. I don't know that the kids were that upset, really, but it's a small thing, but it would have a big impact on kids. They would see, oh, mom and dad think that church is important. Well, in verse 17, we see that God blesses these kids with wisdom and understanding. And that's chokmah and binah in the Hebrew. Chokmah is a good word. Plus, Daniel could understand visions and dreams. So chokmah is a very good Hebrew word we translate as wisdom. And wisdom is applied knowledge. And so according to Gleason Archer, chokmah, wisdom, combines the idea of knowledge arrived at through accurate discernment and the ability or skill to apply that knowledge effectively to the task to be done or to the decision to be made. And Archer says, it certainly applies to understanding the world and life in general, but it is always viewed in relation to God himself, God the creator, the designer, the governor of the universe, God who imparts meaning and value to all that he has fashioned and to all the laws that govern the physical universe and the moral one as well. Because the emphasis of chokmah, of wisdom, is primarily moral and practical. And Chokmah leads to a proper and successful adaptation of what we know to what we have to do. Remember, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Binah, or understanding, emphasizes the power of discernment, the ability to distinguish between appearance and reality, between the false and the true, between evil and good. And so it implies the kind of perceptiveness that can see through any deception or specious appearance and grasp an issue in its proper light. So we could use a lot more Chokmah and Binah in the world today. God may grant wisdom and understanding to us. And remember that Daniel and his friends were granted these things after they had determined not to defile themselves. So we may be blessed with these things or more of them after we commit fully to God and demonstrate or determine not to be conformed to this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. But if we don't commit not to defile ourselves, God may hand us over to the consequences of this lack of wisdom and understanding. Well, Daniel was also given the ability to understand visions and dreams of all kinds, and this will become important as we look at the rest of the story. So we may not have the ability to understand visions, we may not have visions, but we do have spiritual gifts. And these gifts come from God through the Holy Spirit. And we need to be using our spiritual gifts in our lives and especially here at church. Some of the gifts seem a little mundane. The gift of service, you help people. Or the gift of giving, you write a check. That's kind of mundane. But they are all very important to God. Well, Daniel has set upon his heart not to defile himself, and he has gone respectfully to the secular authority and asked to be excused from doing this thing that would defile him. When the authority expressed concern about his own role in the matter, Daniel comes up with a plan that would allow him not to defile himself and will also give confidence to the guard that he's not going to lose his head. That might be kind of important to the guard. So we might learn a few things here from Daniel about how we ought to deal with others when it comes time to preserving our values and not wanting to do things that violate our conscience. And it may not always work, but it is a good place to start. And so we should always give it a try. Then in the 18 to 20, the four young men are presented to Nebuchadnezzar. And this is what it says. It says, at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And so Daniel's plan works out. He has not defiled himself, and when he and the other three are presented to the king, to Nebuchadnezzar, he talks with them and finds none equal to them. And as a bonus, the guard does not lose his head. Well, in the conversation and the questioning, the king finds that they are 10 times better in matters of Chokmah and Binah, wisdom and understanding. 10 times better than all of the people in his kingdom, including his own magicians and enchanters. And so we remember from verse 17 that it was God who gave these four young men wisdom and understanding. And the king would have known that these boys came from Judah and that they worshiped Yahweh. And the commander would have known that Daniel did not want to defile himself. And how the four had gone done a different dietary plan. So the glory for all of this, for the boy's wisdom and understanding, would have gone to God. The king didn't ask, and it doesn't say that the boy spoke up and said, hey, this is from our God. In this case, they do say that in coming up in future passages. If they had been asked, I'm sure they would have said, well, we are nothing, we are only humans, this comes from God. Then to finish up in verse 21, it says, and Daniel remained there in Babylon until the first year of King Cyrus. And so the entire length of Daniel's service in the kingdoms there in Babylon lasted until maybe 536 BC, which was the first year of Cyrus. But then it goes on to say that he received a vision in the third year of Cyrus, probably after he had retired. And so this is maybe 65 years of service to the kings of the Babylon. There was different kingdoms during that time. And then a few years of retirement. And so if he was 14 or so when he was taken from Jerusalem, from Judah, that means he lived to be around 90 years old. So this brings up an important point that I wanted to mention. Apparently it is possible to serve God and to maintain our faith, not to defile ourselves, and to serve in the secular government at the same time. We'll see later that challenges come up from time to time for Daniel and his friends, and they have to choose between following God or doing what the secular government wants them to do. But I think it's important to notice that they were able to be good servants to the secular government while remaining true to God in most circumstances. And so we could do that too if we happen to be called to that kind of thing. Okay, well, in conclusion, just a little recap of today's story. They were required as part of the Babylonian reprogramming effort to eat meat and drink wine. This would have defiled them under God's law, under Jewish purity laws. And so Daniel must have been the leader of the group, because it says that he set upon his heart not to defile himself. It appears that the other three did the same thing. Well, we are not subject to Jewish purity laws, but there are lots of things we do that defile ourselves, and Jesus and Paul both gave us a few ideas of what those things might be. I don't think anything that I read from those passages would come as a surprise to anyone. I'm not even sure why anyone would want to do most of those things. But we do tend to think that some of them are pretty small things, too small to worry about. What's the big deal about a little gossip? We're not actually gossiping, we're sharing prayer concerns. But remember the dad who made the brownies that included just a little bit of dog poop. It was organic, and it didn't change the taste at all. I'm just now wondering how the dad knew that it didn't change the taste. Well, sometimes our avoidance of defiling ourselves might affect other people. It might be a government official of some kind, it might be a business, our employers, maybe our families or our neighbors. As we saw how Daniel was very respectful of the government official, and he came up with a plan to alleviate the official's concerns. God came through for Daniel and his plan and convinced the official to let the four continue without defiling themselves with the food. So when we are faced with a difficult choice, we can be respectful to those people that it affects, and we can try to come up with a plan that will allow us not to defile ourselves, but will address their concerns. And some of those concerns might be legitimate. We don't need to be obnoxious Christians insisting on our rights all the time. God also blesses his people, he blesses us with wisdom and understanding, Hokmah and Binah. If we commit to not defiling ourselves and we choose not to conform to the pattern of this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, God will grant us wisdom and understanding. Wisdom is applied knowledge, and it's primarily moral and practical, leads to proper and successful adaptation of what we know to what we have to do. And we know that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And so turning to God's word is the place to start when we want to develop wisdom. Understanding, on the other hand, emphasizes the power of discernment, the ability to distinguish between appearance and reality, between the false and the true, between evil and good. It implies the kind of perceptiveness that can see through deception or appearances and grasp an issue in its proper light. We could use a lot more wisdom and understanding in the world today, and these are gifts from God, and therefore Christians ought to be in the forefront of wisdom and understanding. When we choose not to defile ourselves and we go about it in a way that respects others, and that is also wisdom and understanding, people will recognize our wisdom and understanding, and the glory will then belong to God. We should give God the credit and the glory. I thought it was interesting that the king recognized the boy's abilities when he was questioning them. And so often our blessings from God will be demonstrated in the way we talk with other people, the things we say to them, as well as the things that we do or don't do. So go out from here today and ask yourself, where am I defiling myself? And where can I make a change? And you can check out Mark 7 or Romans 1 if you're not sure. God tells us, Jesus tells us what defiles people there. We live under the new covenant, and therefore God will write his laws on our hearts. Ask God to bless you with wisdom and understanding. I think James says, if you want wisdom, ask God for it, and he'll give it to you. It will help if we immerse ourselves in God's word, so we have his thoughts on whatever matters we're concerned about. We want his thoughts to bathe our hearts and minds instead of the thoughts of the world. So we have to watch out for those songs and the TV shows and the movies and the social media posts. They are probably affecting us more than we know or want to admit. God will grant us wisdom and understanding, and then when we are confronted with an issue of defilement, we can respectfully come up with a plan to maintain our purity while satisfying the concerns of the other people who are involved, whatever their roles are. So if people do recognize our wisdom and understanding, we should give the glory to God, because he is the source of all good things. Daniel. We get the book of Daniel and we get our own Daniel.
I memorized that one verse when I was just a kid. Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So we got a new understanding tonight of not just purposing, but said.
How to turn it off.
Now let's see if we can come back to where we were. Well, first of all,